Imagine standing at a crossroads, each path leading to a different type of story. One promises epic battles and world-changing magic. Another whispers of hidden powers in modern cities. Every fantasy writer faces these crossroads when deciding what kind of story to tell. And in this video, I'll show you how understanding these subgenres isn't just helpful, it's the difference between endless rewrites and a story that actually works. Let me start with epic fantasy, the subgenre that laid the foundation for modern fantasy literature. Now, you might think epic fantasy just means big stories with lots of magic, but there's so much more to it than that. When J.R.R. Tolkien created Middle-earth, he did more than tell a story about a ring. He showed us how epic fantasy works on multiple levels. While Frodo dealt with his personal struggle to resist the ring's corruption, entire kingdoms mobilized for war and ancient prophecies came true. This layering of personal and epic stakes is what makes the subgenre so powerful. Here's what too many writers miss about epic fantasy. It's not about having the biggest battles or the most complex magic system. It's about showing how individual choices ripple out to affect entire worlds. I learned this the hard way when I started writing. I focused so much on creating magic systems and political intrigue that I forgot to create characters that would make readers even care about all these grand events. So let me show you how to make epic fantasy work effectively. First, your magic system isn't just about spells. It shapes economies, influences politics, and affects how ordinary people live. Look at how Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series does this brilliantly. The ability to use metals for magic creates a whole society structured around access to these resources. Secondly then, when building your world, start with one major element. Maybe it's a unique magic source or a powerful empire, and then consider its ripple effects. How does it change warfare, trade routes, religious beliefs? This creates natural complexity without getting overwhelmed by details. And most importantly, remember that even world-changing events need personal stakes. Your readers might care about saving the kingdom, but they'll care more about saving the character they've grown to love. George R.R. Martin masters this in A Song of Ice and Fire. We care about who sits on the Iron Throne because we care about how it affects characters we've grown to love or hate. But what if we want to bring magic closer to home? That's where low fantasy changes everything we think we know about magical stories. Think of low fantasy like discovering there's a hidden door in your own house. Everything looks familiar until you notice something extraordinary hiding in plain sight. Instead of creating entirely new worlds, low fantasy reveals the magic lurking in our own. T.H. White's The Once and Future King shows us this brilliantly. Instead of whisking us away to a completely magical realm, he brings Merlin's magic into the recognizable medieval world. The result? Magic feels more wondrous because it's breaking through the ordinary world we know. Here's what makes low fantasy particularly powerful for new writers. You don't need to build an entire world from scratch. Instead, you're creating cracks in reality where magic seeps through. This approach can be especially freeing for writers who feel overwhelmed by extensive world building. The key to writing compelling low fantasy lies in making the extraordinary feel natural within our familiar world. Instead of explaining your magic, show how characters adapt to it. Pay attention to the ripple effects of magical elements in everyday life. A character who can sense lies might avoid family gatherings. A shop that sells genuine love potions would need very careful customer screening. These small details make your world feel believable and real. Always remember though that the low in low fantasy doesn't mean low stakes. It means the magic is subtle, weaving through ordinary life rather than dominating it. But next then, let me share what happens when we add magic to real historical events. A combination that's given us some of the most compelling fantasy stories of the past decade. When Naomi Novik wrote His Majesty's Dragons, she didn't just add dragons to the Napoleonic Wars, she considered how aerial combat would change military strategy, diplomatic relations, and social hierarchies. This attention to both historical accuracy and magical implications is what makes historical fantasy sing. Writing historical fantasy requires a delicate balance between fact and imagination. Your research provides the foundation, understanding how people actually lived, fought, and traded during your chosen period. But here's what I've learned from my own background in history. Don't let historical accuracy paralyze you. Focus on the details that matter to your story and your characters. The magic you introduce should feel like it could have been there all along, hidden in the gaps between recorded events. Maybe the Great Fire of London was actually caused by a magical duel, or perhaps the success of certain historical figures came from supernatural abilities they kept secret. The real power of historical fantasy comes from exploring how magic might have influenced the events we think we know. But what if we want to take our readers somewhere completely new? That's where Portal Fantasy opens up endless possibilities, literally. When C.S. Lewis wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he understood something crucial about Portal Fantasy. It's not just about the magical world on the other side. It's about how crossing that threshold changes someone forever. Lucy doesn't just discover Narnia, she discovers parts of herself she never knew existed. Creating effective Portal Fantasy starts with understanding both worlds, the familiar and the magical. Your character's ordinary world needs to feel real enough that readers understand why they might want to escape it, or what they risk losing by leaving it. The crossing point itself, whether it's a wardrobe, a mysterious door, or a crack between worlds, should feel both magical and somehow right for your story. Think about what this specific portal reveals about your world and your character. A business executive might find a portal in an abandoned office building, while a grieving child might discover one in their grandmother's garden. But here's where many writers stumble. They focus so much on the magical world that they forget the importance of the journey back. Every trip through your portal should change your character in ways that matter in both worlds. And for more tips and tricks about genres, characters, and everything else fantasy writing, make sure to sign up for my free weekly newsletter and get my Emotional Waypoint Starter Kit to begin planning your story right away. You can find the link in the description below. Moving on, what if magic isn't hiding behind a portal though? Instead, it's right here in our cities, hiding in plain sight. Urban fantasy brings magic into our modern world in ways that can make readers question their own reality. Think of urban fantasy like jazz music in a busy city. It's got its own rhythm, its own rules, and while not everyone can hear it, once you do, you realize it's been there all along, weaving through the concrete and steel. Jim Butcher's Dresden Files shows us how this can work amazingly. Chicago becomes more than just a setting, it's almost a character in of itself, with magical elements integrated so naturally into its geography and culture that you'll find yourself looking differently at your own city's dark alleys and abandoned buildings going forward. Writing urban fantasy means looking at our modern world sideways and asking, what if? Maybe that coffee shop on the corner serves something special to customers with a certain glow in their eyes. Perhaps those subway delays aren't really maintenance issues at all, but something much stranger. Your modern setting gives you tools that traditional fantasy doesn't. Technology, bureaucracy, social media. Use these to create unique conflicts. How does a werewolf explain their monthly absences to their LinkedIn network? What happens when someone posts actual magic on TikTok? These contemporary elements can create fascinating tensions with traditional magical elements. But sometimes you might desire a darker twist. So let me take you into the shadows and show you what happens when fantasy itself turns to the dark side. When Glenn Cook wrote The Black Company, he showed us that dark fantasy isn't just about adding more violence. It's about exploring complex moral choices in a world where light and dark aren't clearly defined. His mercenary company does terrible things for arguably good reasons, leaving readers to wrestle with uncomfortable questions. Dark fantasy thrives in the gray areas of morality. Your characters might need to use forbidden magic to save someone they love, or betray their principles to prevent something worse. The world itself should reflect these moral complexities. Maybe your magic system takes a toll on the user's humanity, or perhaps your religious orders have corrupted their own prophecies for power. These elements should raise questions rather than provide easy answers. Remember though, dark doesn't mean hopeless. Your story can explore difficult themes while still offering moments of grace and redemption, because often the darkest settings allow the smallest acts of kindness to shine brightest. Finally, let's talk about a subgenre that strips fantasy down to its thrilling core. Think of sword and sorcery like a shot of espresso compared to epic fantasy's full course meal. It's concentrated, potent, and gets straight to the action. Robert E. Howard wrote Conan the Barbarian. In doing so, he wasn't trying to save the world. He was telling stories about one warrior facing immediate visceral challenges. This focus on personal stakes and immediate action creates a different kind of excitement than epic fantasy's world-spanning conflicts. Writing effective sword and sorcery means keeping things personal and immediate. Your hero isn't trying to fulfill an ancient prophecy, they're trying to survive the next fight, steal the next treasure, or escape the next monster. Your magic here should feel dangerous and unpredictable rather than systematic. Instead of complicated magical rules, focus on the cost and consequences of power. The key is maintaining momentum. Your world exists to create exciting challenges for your protagonist, not to explore complex political systems. Build your setting through action and conflict rather than exposition. Let readers discover your world the same way your character does, one dangerous encounter at a time. But picking a genre is just one step in a long road towards a finished novel. So watch this video here next, where I share with you the exact steps I'd take if I'd start writing a new fantasy novel in 2025.